Welcome back, Senator Lee, to the committee, and appreciate you've had your work cut out for you today in your new role as chairman of your committee. But the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Senator Rubio, for your willingness to serve in this position. I'm going to make a bold prediction and say that you are likely to be confirmed. That's my prediction. I can't speak for others, but I believe that nonetheless, and it's a bittersweet moment. I'm back on the committee after 12 years of being away from it. You and I came to this committee and to the Senate at the same time, both in our late 30s, the youngest members of the Senate at the time, although you have me by exactly 7 days, 7 days older. Notwithstanding the fact that you were the older between us, you've got all of your hair, and it's not a single gray hair in there. But I've deeply enjoyed working with you as a colleague and getting to know you as a friend. We have kids that are about the same age, and I've watched yours grow, and it's just been a delight getting to know you, Jeanette, and your kids, and I hope that'll continue. But I'll miss having you here, not only as my Spanish teacher, not only as my source of Bible insights and my source of comedic material, but also for your great insights on foreign policy, domestic policy, and everything else we do here. You've just been great to work with, and you will be missed in the very likely event that you are confirmed. Let's talk first about the Western Hemisphere, an issue that I know is near and dear to your heart and mine. And we'll start with the Panama Canal. President Trump has recently talked a little bit about the fact that there are some questions arising about the status of the Panama Canal. When we look to the treaty at issue, the treaty concerning the permanent neutrality and operation of the Panama Canal, we're reminded that some things maybe aren't quite as they should be there right now, given that the Chinese now control major ports at the entry and the exit to the canal. It seems appropriate to say that there's at least an open question. There's some doubt as to whether the canal remains neutral. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yeah, and yes. Here's the challenge. Number one is, look, I want to be clear about something. The Panamanian government, particularly its current office holders, are very friendly to the United States and very cooperative, and we want that to continue. And I want to bifurcate that from the broader issue of the canal. Now, President Trump is not inventing this. This is something that's existed now for at least a decade in my service here. I took a trip to Panama in 2017. When on that trip to Panama in 2017, it was the central issue we discussed about the canal, and that is that Chinese companies control port facilities at both ends of the canal, the east and the west. And the concerns among military officials and security officials, including in Panama at that point, that could one day be used as a choke point to impede commerce in a moment of conflict. That's going back to that. But before you got here, and I don't want to have to dig through this folder to find it again, but basically cited that how the immediate past head of Southern Command, just retired General Richardson, said she flew over the canal, looked down and saw those Chinese port facilities and said, those look like dual-use facilities that in a moment of conflict could be weaponized against us. The bipartisan China Commission over in the House last year had testimony and hearings on this issue, and members of both parties expressed concern. The former ambassador to Panama that served under President Obama has expressed those concerns. This is a legitimate issue that needs to be confronted. The second point is the one you touched upon, and that is, look, could an argument be made? And I'm not prepared to answer it yet because it's something we're going to have to study very carefully, but I think I have an inkling of I know where this is going to head. Can an argument be made that the Chinese basically have effective control of the canal anytime they want? Because if they order a Chinese company that controls the ports to shut it down or impede our transit, they will have to do so. There is no independent Chinese companies. They all exist because they've been identified as national champions. They're supported by the Chinese government, and if you don't do what they want, they find a new CEO, and you end up being replaced and removed. So they're on the complete control of their government. This is a legitimate question, and one that Senator Risch had some insight as well. He mentioned that in passing, that needs to be looked at. This is not a joke. The Panama Canal issue is a very serious one.
And so the mere potentiality of that, the ability to exercise that control, even until such time as they do it, as they do shut it down, is a concern, is it not?
Well, I listened 48 hours ago to FBI Director Wray in one of his exit interviews he gave to the press, and he said the Chinese are embedded in our utilities and critical infrastructure. Now, he didn't say every single day they're shutting off the power in the United States. He said that if there's a conflict, they're embedded and they could shut off the power in key places. We've all identified that as a threat. The fact that you can do it, you don't have to do it every day. No one's claiming that the Chinese are shutting down the canal every day. What the claim is, the very legitimate concern is, that if these companies control both ends of that canal in a time of conflict and the Chinese tell them, shut it down and don't let the U.S. go through there, we got a big, big problem, a big economic problem and a big national security and defense problem. The ability to do it alone is a threat. We shouldn't ignore it. It isn't a joke. It's a legitimate issue, and it needs to be solved.
Excellent. And that feeds right into the next thing I wanted to ask you about, which it just involves areas of dual-use capabilities throughout the Western Hemisphere. Ports, infrastructure, critical minerals, and so forth. We've had policies from the Biden administration involving the supercilious use of untargeted foreign aid and sort of cultural coercion in order to persuade them to, or in an effort to coerce some of these countries to adopt policies that are contrary to their established cultural norms, abortion rights, LGBT policies and curriculum, and so forth. That probably hasn't helped in this conflict, in this still somewhat soft conflict in which many of these countries are opening their doors to China. I can't imagine that will have helped. How will your approach to Chinese incursion in the Western Hemisphere be different from those of the current administration?
Well, there are a couple points. The first is the Chinese incursion in the hemisphere involves, number one, investment of dollars. Like, as an example, they go into some country, they say, here's $5 million or $10 million to build a stadium, but in exchange, you have to let us build out your 5G network using Huawei, safe cities, and the like. And by the way, here's a couple $1 million for you and your friends as a bribe. Okay, that's their first level of engagement. They go in and then in some ways they create deals that you can not possibly pay back. So now you've got a debt that you can't pay back and they have you trapped. And now they've got your vote at the UN and your cooperation on X, Y, and Z. And that happened in Panama, by the way. In 2016, 2017, that was well understood that part of the investments they made in Panama were conditioned upon Panama's ability to convince the Dominican Republic and other countries to flip their recognition away from Taiwan. That happened. So that's number one. The second element of their involvement is they go into a country and a Chinese company will buy up the lithium mines or access to the rare earth minerals in these long-term contracts. And that exists in allied countries. The Argentines will tell you there are a number of business deals that the Chinese and Chinese companies have gotten a hold of in Argentina that even if they wanted to back away, they can't get out of the deals because of the way they were structured. So that's number two. And then number three is their presence. The Chinese are actively involved in military installations in the Western Hemisphere on the island of Cuba, 90 miles from our shores. Only a few hundred miles from where Space Force operates and NASA and Cape Canaveral. Only a few miles from MacDill, where we have Central Command and Special Operations Command. Only a few miles from Southern Command. Only a few miles from Eglin Air Force Base and the test range we have out in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these things, this is real, and it's operating right off the coast of the United States. They have a presence in our region. So we have to acknowledge that this is happening, and then we have to be present and have counters to each of these, and/or there has to be consequences for each of these. Fortunately, the United States has strong relationships in multiple key countries in the region, and I think we have the opportunity to build upon that and in ways that can attract the sort of investment that they would rather have than the Chinese investment. But right now it's not available. It's not happening. There is no American alternative to what the Chinese are offering. So hopefully we can provide the openings for that.
Indeed, and I appreciate your enthusiasm and thoughtfulness in providing that answer. Now, you touch on another issue when you reference the significance of agreements made by prior administrations. Obviously, the Javier Milei administration in Argentina wouldn't have been as likely to enter into those arrangements as his predecessor was. In the United States, we have to keep this in mind. The Constitution, of course, allocates the treaty-making and binding power. It spreads it out between two branches. The president can enter into a treaty, can sign a treaty, but that treaty isn't ratified unless 2/3 of the Senate does it. So it flips the usual legislative process because it's a different type of legislation. Would you agree with me that that type of arrangement, which is submission of a treaty after the president has entered into it, after the president has signed it, The submission of that treaty to the Senate for ratification and the ultimate ratification by the Senate is a necessary precondition for an international agreement to be binding on the United States of America.
To be binding beyond the administration that entered into it. This was the case of the JCPOA, which was being sold to people as a treaty, but it wasn't. And the reason why it was a political agreement. It's basically a political arrangement between the current administration and the regime in Iran, and that's why President Trump had the authority to pull us out of it when he did. I think what's important to understand about treaties in general, and we talked about treaties here today with Mexico. There are a number of other treaties that people may not be aware of. Every treaty, by definition, okay, is a surrender of sovereignty at some level as a nation. But you do it and you enter into it. Why? Why do you enter into a treaty even though you're surrendering some sovereignty? Because you've concluded that that surrender and the benefit of it to the national interest or the national security far outweighs the surrender of sovereignty and the consequences of it. And that is why it's so critical that the Senate be involved in that deliberation, because an individual administration may get that calculus wrong. But when you have this overwhelming majority that concludes that it too agrees that that surrender of sovereignty is exceeded by the benefit of the treaty, now you know you've increased your chances of have something that's good and makes sense. And so, I agree with your view of it, and I think that's the way I would hope we would pursue arrangements in the future if we enter into any.
That's why it takes 2/3. Thank you so much, Senator Rubio. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Rubio, we know you have